So this video is actually the one that got me started on wanting to create the whole series because I was excited to present information in terms of tracking where Homo colossus has been based on signs of its technosphere. So normally when you are trying to track the traces of an animal, you would either look for their paw prints or scat or for their dwellings, whether that is a nest that a bird built out of sticks or this rock nest that fish called a chub constructs. And normal Homo sapiens isn't all that different. They construct their shelters out of resources, materials that they are consuming well below the rate at which the environment is able to furnish them. By the time those huts need patching, more branches will have grown or fallen to be able to replace what they had used. Whereas Homo colossus, the freaks on Earth, build what John Milsom would call a technosphere. And I like the word technosphere more than infrastructure, even though it makes it sound a little bit more like a conspiracy theory, because it also sounds more sinister. And I think an important distinction is one between paths and roads, because paths are just worn down when you walk over a place a lot of time, but roads are specifically designed to be able to haul things on them. Like they can accommodate wheels, and once you have wheels, you can start dragging more material places, and then suddenly you get into the business of massive scale resource extraction. Maybe that's silly, but it's just something that occurred to me while I was running, and I run a lot. And because of its commitment to constructing this technosphere, Homo colossus has a huge appetite for stone, sand, metals, trees for construction or for burning, and fossil fuels in liquid or solid or gaseous states. So its metabolism in this sense is not modest. It is going through extracting and using resources at this huge rate that far surpasses what any other species is taking advantage of for their own structures and tools. And here in this graph, this shows, I've shown this one before on my Substack, that the amount of materials at this point that form the man-made world is equal to the dry mass of all of the living material on the surface of the planet. And if raccoons or spiders were doing this on even a fraction of the scale that Homo colossus is doing it, Homo colossus would see that as a reason to panic, an intolerable threat. It would be the type of thing that they would make a horror movie about. And yet, when they're doing it, it's like nothing to see here. This is totally natural. And what's also interesting is that if you were to ask a member of Homo colossus, well, are humans the chosen ones with a special destiny among all other animals? They would say, well, of course not. I'm not religious. That's absurd, whatever. And I accept that humans are animals. You'd be like, okay, but then explain to me, isn't it strange that we are pursuing a style of existence that is so different from all the other animals, and that we are extracting so much material to create an entire built world that encircles the globe and serves primarily us? And they'd be like, oh no, that's cool. We don't realize how strange it is what Homo colossus is doing to the planet, specifically in terms of the technosphere and all this infrastructure. I think people are currently alarmed right now about the fact that we're powering everything with fossil fuels, but many people don't yet see that that plumbing is weird per se. And so what I said in the first video about Homo colossus's diet and what Daniel Quinn had to say about takers and leavers applies here too with the technosphere. The driving force beneath it seems to be a desire to seize control, but really all you're doing is creating an illusion of control. The technosphere is about redesigning the entire planet to, instead of having it be about harmony, have it be about suiting human preferences and only our societies. Like if there were any humans, as there are still today, if there's any humans that aren't on board with this and want to kind of exist within places that are undeveloped that haven't been paved over and turned into a parking lot yet, and they're just living in like the Amazon or whatever and making it work successfully for hundreds of thousands of years, like they need to get out of the way is the mantra. Whoops, edit. According to Google, humans have only inhabited the Amazon basin for at least 11,200 years of continuous occupation, and some estimates place the early sediments between 32,000 and 39,000 years ago. So I shouldn't say hundreds of thousands of years, it's only tens of thousands. Still longer than any complex society has been able to make it work. But anyway, the other point that I was trying to make is that the technospheric approach is the antithesis to a religion or cultural ideology or personal life philosophy where you just go with the flow and mind your own business for the most part, maybe trying to intervene in some minor ways to promote a better situation, but definitely not trying to harness and administer an entire region or continent or planet. And even now, in responses to the polycrisis, often people have good intentions, but they can't break out of seeing us as puppet masters of the planet who have maybe messed up so far, but now we can use the same methods that we have before of trying to control an entire region, but just turn it around for good, and always seeing like engineering as a potentially positive approach despite its history. See, I have written in my notes restraint, so Homo sapiens exercising restraint, Homo colossus not. Homo colossus is about expansion and just converting the whole planet into our little playground. They're also, as I have noted here, rigging the game to work in our favor, trying to give ourselves an advantage over all the other species, both in terms of access to food, but also access to medical care, access to air conditioning, access to entertainment. I've also noticed that Homo colossus tends to interrupt things that are cyclical and force them to be linear. For example, like you think plumbing. So normally an animal that lives in nature will like poop out there, and then that just gets decomposed and reintegrated and becomes everything new and the circle of life. And also when they die. Whereas with humans, at least where I live, the way that the waste management system works is you flush your poop, it goes to the water treatment center, and then it gets like dehydrated and trucked to a landfill. So like all of our excrement is just piling up at a landfill and emitting methane and all that as it decomposes, instead of going back into the soil where it could enrich it with nutrients. And even when we do that with sewage sludge, obviously that's containing all kinds of chemicals. So like even when we try to make things slightly more cyclical, we're just polluting and we're destroying the soil. And I think that's a matter of scale and complexity. So the quantity of humans and the qualities of our relationships. So when you have 50 people who are coordinating and organizing themselves as a unit within some kind of previous smaller society, it's really easy to keep tabs on everyone and make sure that everyone is being accountable and no one is dropping the ball, and to communicate and just kind of keep all the loose ends really neat. Versus once you get into a larger, more complex society, it just becomes impossible to behave responsibly because everyone is so specialized and is being pulled in so many different directions, that there just isn't the same like guardrails aren't in place, and you actually have to like really fight and pull teeth to even try to do anything that is environmentally responsible. And you may have heard Robin Wall Kimmerer's term honorable harvest. And what it seems to me is that most other species, what it means for them to stay in their lane is that they keep their activities pretty much to the surface of the planet. They don't try to take over too much of the like flat horizontal space, except for kudzu. And they also don't mine down too deeply. They only consume the resources for the most part that naturally grow back. And when it comes to things that aren't, I'm going to say unalive, not to limit, I don't want to necessarily define what is alive and what is not, but when we think of things like stones, if they're taking stones, they're taking the ones that are available on the surface. In contrast, Homo colossus seems to be obsessed with stripping material from below the surface and harvesting it faster from above the surface, and then it can be replenished. And so that is why, civilizations are sucking up fossil fuels, mining for rock and minerals. We see that happening here. I've pictured an ancient Egyptian quarry as well as an ancient Roman mine. And then also, we're depleting the soil and causing deforestation, all of that. At the moment that I'm recording this in 2025, there's a lot of debate and concern about which group of humans is in charge of the technosphere and which form of power is powering it, right? So in America, Republicans, they're Democrats, or elsewhere in the world, right wing or not, or whatever. And then, fossil fuels or clean energy. And instead, fundamentally, the source of the problem is just about which materials a species is accessing, if there are any of those that kind of exist below the surface, and then also in terms of the ones that grow back, the rate at which it's accessing them, if they're actually having an opportunity to grow back and be restored, if the soil is being able to be regenerated or not. Now here's an extremely simple representation of how an animal or plant that, in a sense, behaves itself and stays in its lane exists on the planet. It is in a relationship with the biosphere that is more or less unproblematic. It is surviving based on accessing resources that grow above ground for the most part, or are found above ground, and they grow back at a rate that it can continue to rely on. Whereas Homo colossus is engaged in a lot of things that cannot continue. First of all, it constructs this technosphere, which I've written out for you here with some examples, includes factories and facilities, buildings, roads, bridges, railways, the power grid, plumbing, data centers and cables, tires, vehicles, machinery, equipment, appliances, various devices. And then built on top of those are these abstract institutions like long-distance supply chains, electricity, the internet, grocery stores, modern medicine, and government. And the infrastructure, or what I'm referring to here as the technosphere, cannot come into existence or continue to exist and undergo constant maintenance without harm to the environment, both in terms of habitat destruction and pollution, and yes, air pollution and emissions, but also other forms of ecological devastation. And I think that now that some people are becoming aware of the potential, or actually guarantee, of civilization collapse, they are thinking that somehow, and it is easy to make this mistake, that because a lot of the institutions that we like, government, school, and stuff like that, because they're kind of abstract and we don't necessarily associate them with their material requirements, it's easy to think that those things can be perfected and reformed and made into something that could potentially persist and also be innocent, not inflict harm on the environment. Because after all, like, the concept of government and schooling and supply chains and medical care, they're all kind of they're not material. It's an idea. All of those concepts have like very real material foundations, which are that infrastructure. And because that infrastructure, the technosphere, is always harmful, dominating, and temporary, it follows that anything that is built on that is also inevitably going to be harmful, a form of human supremacy, and temporary. Another unique thing about Homo colossus is how they've organized their activity. Similar to the way that ants in an anthill do, they've outsourced their agency to the collective. Lisi Kroll was among the first to describe human civilizations as a superorganism. Like, there are our individual behaviors, and then they add up to an emergent impact which no one actually wants. And I've come to see that there's a difference between power and control. Power is the ability to influence things, but not necessarily in a direction that you are aware of or would want them to go. And then control is actually having control over a situation and the direction that it's going in. And what the human collective, civilized human collective, has because of its scale and because of the impossibility of getting 8 billion humans to cooperate at this point in a good way, we're only seeing an example of power and not control. And the things that are organizing our behaviors are mainly the government, mostly by, providing certain programs, but also making certain things unlawful and punishing you if you break those laws. And then also a major organizing principle for most of our activities are companies. Like, companies dictate how all of the humans within the civilization are behaving for the most part, because either it is your working hours and you are spending time working to support some company and its goals, or in your free time, you are a consumer of the goods and services of a certain company that is able to offer those because it is dictating the actions of the people that are under its command. So I've been thinking about the technosphere as the circulatory system of the superorganism, which is acting like a tick, sucking blood or resources out of the planet. And what's unique about this framing is that in other ways that we talk about the world, we might separate, say, the global north from the global south, or the elites from other socioeconomic groups and whatnot. But in this case, someone like Jeff Bezos, as well as someone who is, say, an artisanal miner or dependent on, eating the food that is brought to them by USAID, these people would be part of the same machine. They don't enjoy the same status or lifestyle within it, but they are all kind of almost locked into it and dependent on it for different reasons, simply because they don't have alternatives available to them. And the only human beings that are more or less external to the tick or this giant machine spider, the superorganism, are the ones who are not really participating in the economy. And one implication of this is that although we like to blame specific entities like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk or Exxon or whatever for the trouble that we are in, what this really is that because so many of us are plugged into these supply chains as both producers and consumers, every member of Homo colossus, no matter their status, is a tiny cog in the wheel helping the technosphere to continue functioning, or at least they definitely aren't hindering it. When you show up to your job, you aren't doing anything to stop this mega robot monster from sucking resources out of the planet. It's like a beer bike where everyone is pedaling, but no one is really steering. And here people might say, fairly enough, that, well, they don't approve of what elites and billionaires are doing by owning private jets and riding shuttles into outer space and all that kind of stuff. But the fact remains that a lot of the ways that we survive in a very basic way. So if you are someone who eats food that you didn't grab directly from the environment, whether you foraged for it or gardened or whatever, if it came from someone else's work far away, then actually you do have a vested interest in keeping the machine running. Because I think that even when people are like, yeah, we have to end this harmful thing that is destroying the planet, it's like, do you understand that that harmful thing is the reason that you eat every day? And if it were to, I think if we were to literally consider the idea of shutting it off, suddenly a lot of people that are marching and protesting and asserting that we do need to shut it down, if they actually understood everything that we would be shutting down, then they would be like, whoa, we do want to keep some certain things plugged in and running. And that's what I mean, is that a lot of us are so entangled in a lot of the technosphere's operations that are harmful, and our survival is ironically dependent on it, because also that process is self-destructive. And at first, these early members of Homo colossus may have built the technosphere to serve them, but now they are serving it. So, we joke that our iPhones are extensions of ourselves. And in fact, in the book Overshoe, Catton does say that our machines and their metabolisms are like extensions of us, or these prosthetics, and that we kind of share a metabolism, or that their metabolism should be kind of factored into when we are calculating hours. But at this point, aren't you the extension of your iPhone? I mean, why are people working 40 plus hours a week, many of them at jobs that they don't particularly care about or wouldn't choose to be in if they could, get the day off or unlimited vacation or whatever, while the world falls apart around them? Why? To keep the refrigerator running, to keep the car tuned up, to qualify for access to the organic matter that the trucks hold on them.
I'm talking about shopping for groceries.
It's humans serving machines at this point. And yet, Earth cannot continue over a long term to support multiple colonies of half-machine creatures like Homo colossus, like creatures like myself. It's not in her budget. It was never going to be. It never can be. And so I will show you now this spectrum of impermanence, because all things in the universe are ultimately impermanent. So things at the end that tends to last the longest is things like glaciers or the existence of a specific species. And then the things that tend to exist as phenomena for the shortest amount of time is something like a nest in a tree, which will, fall apart after a few years of being exposed to the elements, as well as individual lives, compared to like how many billions of years the planet has been around. A single individual lifetime is not that long for a mammal. And then somewhere in between is the duration of any potential civilization. And one thing that I see people will bring up of like, well, what if we sized it down? What if we had, less industrial activity, fewer people, whatever? But what occurs to me is that like, if you have a smaller technosphere, it'll have a smaller appetite, but also a smaller resource base from which to extract. So its lifespan would still be relatively short. So unfortunately, creatures like myself have been raised to be dependent on a system that is artificial and, more importantly, temporary. And that is why you will hear people refer to this as a predicament. Problems have solutions. Predicaments only have responses. There is no way out, in a sense. We can only deal with the consequences of the position that we find ourselves in as best as we can. If you understand what the technosphere does to the biosphere, what its creation and expansion and even just its maintenance does to the biosphere, it's hard to root for Team Technosphere. But also, if you're one of the humans that is dependent on that technosphere, as are our pets to some extent, they're in like the Petco industrial complex, it also makes it hard to root for the end of the technosphere. So it doesn't really look good either way. And in the end, what we're going to get is the end of the technosphere. And what's a little bit weird about Homo colossus culture is that the technosphere, in a sense, inflicts doom, destroys worlds, destroys other beings, converts everything to the human playground, to a glorified parking lot, and yet it is taboo within Homo colossus cultures to suggest that anything really bad is happening or that our way of existence is temporary. Like, if we're going to label anyone a doomer, shouldn't it be the people who are championing the technosphere? Because they're the ones that are cheering for Homo colossus to continue its way of existence and continue expanding this, the artificial cyber tick that is sucking everything out of the planet and to, so that they can continue to have institutions and all these things that are entirely unknown to other species. Like, those are the people that are on a platform, like their campaign is pro-doom. People like Ezra Klein, who can make a lot of money off of book sales that suggest that we can have our cake and eat it too, continuing as we have been. So in the diet video, I prompted you to imagine if raccoons were doing to the planet what Homo colossus is currently doing to the planet, and what kind of panicked reaction Homo colossus would have in response to that. Now I'm going to ask you to imagine that scenario again, but this time put yourselves in the shoes of the raccoon. So if they were doing that, how delusional would they have to be convinced that this is how things are meant to be, and that they're just special and that they'll be fine? And maybe part of what makes this all hard to believe is that, well, you would think that if you and your whole culture and your whole way of life were really that evil or villainous, like if that was the role, if that were really the role that we're playing in this story, would daily life be so mundane? Like, could biosphere annihilation feel so average? At which point I would point you to this video, or this movie rather, Zone of Interest, which is about a family of Nazis who's living right next to a concentration camp and carrying on as if everything is just sunshine and daisies. And so I think that humans are very capable of dissociating and repressing and tuning out. And I think part of why we don't see things this way, or why many members of Homo colossus don't recognize that the technosphere itself is a problem, as well as the institutions that it makes possible, is because most of us were born at a time when the technosphere already existed. So it's always been here, and so we don't notice it. We take it for granted. Whereas if you could do like a longer term time lapse of the planet, you would appreciate how much Homo colossus has transformed it, and the amount of damage that was necessary to create that, and also that continues to be necessary to maintain it, because most of us are occupying spaces that are already developed, whereas a lot of the damage, a lot of the continued resource extraction is occurring at the fringes, because only the resources in wilderness are like up for grabs, whereas whatever minerals might exist below Manhattan, like, I don't think any company is ever going to try to access those. And so a lot of the continuing exploitation occurs out of sight and therefore out of mind. And I think that's also why, when it comes to climate change, people are actually noticing climate, because it takes something that packs a ton of chaos into a short time span for us to actually notice and recognize it as a problem, because so much of the other environmental harm is just happening in places that we have no connection to physically. Whereas if a flood comes to your doorstep, like, that's what it takes for you to notice. And at the same time, because you are so dependent on the technosphere, you don't know life without it. And as far as you can tell, the technosphere solves problems and makes lives better. So then that's also why people propose it as a solution. And I think that the fact that Homo colossus is such an engineering-oriented creature, they are, and when I say they, I mean we, of course, myself, tend to be convinced that there must be a way to continue securing what they want, to turn what they want into reality. And where I see this come up is when you criticize one suggested solution, people turn around and be like, okay, well, if you don't like my plan, what's yours? And it's like, well, who said that there had to be a plan? I'm saying that the answer is none of the above will work. I also see this in Reddit. There was a post, someone was asking, with good intentions, what job can I get to help prevent environmental collapse? But the thing is, if there are jobs, that means that the technosphere is working, because that's how there can be institutions. And so, like, if you're still able to actually get a job, that's just like already a bad sign that, like, the technosphere and civilization is still in the process of destroying the planet. So actually, if it were to stop destroying the planet, there would be no jobs the way that we imagine them available. You could still go out and plant a tree, but you'd probably also be struggling to find food. So, and I liked the way that I phrased this, so I'm going to read off of my notes. Maybe it's as simple as this. When a species does a solid job of setting itself up for massive disaster and tragedy, the likely outcome that it will get is massive disaster and tragedy. I've also written, I don't know how a culture whose whole mantra is to offload costs onto others, copes when it begins to pay in a major way. So I'm going to wrap up with 2 quotes from other people. The first one is from Dugald Hine in his book At Work in the Ruins. And he was suggesting that fossil fuels they're bad, but they're not at the heart of the problem. Instead, he asks us to consider, did we get here because of an approach to the world, a way of seeing and treating everything that would always have brought us to such a pass, even if the climate system had been less sensitive to our industrial emissions? Okay, and then the second one is from Max Wilbert, and I'll link to the video that this whole monologue is from. But he says, you know, every civilization that has existed on this planet until this point has destroyed its ecological foundations and then collapsed, and that we are not immune to that. We are subject to the exact same limits and ecological laws as those peoples, and we may be perhaps more aware of the process playing out. We may have better science telling us why the droughts are coming, how exactly they're functioning, how the climate is changing and the extreme weather accelerating, why our economic system is in serious trouble, why we're seeing catastrophic declines in ocean productivity and fish populations, why we're seeing songbird populations collapsing, insect populations collapsing. We may have the paleoarchaeology to look at previous societies and how they've made mistakes and destroyed the land around them. And we have the paleobotany records and the ice cores and sediment in lakes. And we say, this is what drove those previous societies to collapse. We have all this knowledge, we have all this information, this science, this modern technology. I don't think that's going to change the course that we're on fundamentally. I don't think the challenges we're facing, the ecocide crisis, the ecocidal crisis that we're accelerating faster and faster into, is a technical problem. I think it's a cultural problem. In many ways, it's even a spiritual problem. So anyway, that's it. That's the end of this video. Go have a nice day.